I'm an engineer. I'm not just an engineer, I'm a hydrologist, which makes me a damned engineer. So I'm an old soil and water engineer perspective, right? But I also have been working since I was undergraduate. I got an undergraduate in agronomy at Oklahoma State, trying to feed the world. Because I graduated from high school in 1980, but what was happening in the global news media in 1980? You guys remember? Ethiopia was starving. It was the first mass media starvation event that we got to witness on live television in Ethiopia. So that made a big impact on me. So I wanted to feed the world. And a lot of us got into agricultural sciences because of that. And my hero at the time was this, ranked as my hero, was this fellow named Norman Borlaug, who was a friend and colleague of my mentor at Oklahoma State, Gary Grant. So I got the opportunity to meet Norm at Texas A&M and ultimately to work with him when I finished my PhD at Oklahoma State in biosystems engineering. I went to my first academic position was at Texas A&M, so I worked with Norm for about 5 years before he retired from public life, and then I went on to find someplace else to work because the dean of the College of Ag told me to stop using the word sustainability in my proposals to make the stakeholders nervous. And you guys are the stakeholders. It was making me nervous. Actually, it wasn't. It was making the academics nervous because the stakeholders wanted to understand the challenges of the future more. But the academics were nervous about it because they didn't understand it. So when we talk about sustainability, and I'm going to talk about that a lot because I can't talk about anything without talking about that context. Really what we're talking about is risk management and understanding risk. I'll be talking tomorrow explicitly about the science of sustainability tomorrow afternoon. I was asked to talk to you today by Jim and others about the impacts of GMO products on food security and trade. I've been working for the last couple of years with the United States Soybean Export Council, especially focusing on Europe and Asia, and trying to understand where the barriers of trade are. It gives a great opportunity for us to export a bunch of soybeans to Europe. We don't need to export corn to Europe. China would probably buy, according to everything we produce, that we don't want to keep ourselves. But soybeans are a different story. Right now, the predominant import market for European soybeans is Brazil. And of course, what that means is they're bulldozing rainforests to convert into production lands and creating significant ecological pressure. So when I talk about the impacts of GMO products on food security and trade, security really is about stability, about safety. It's about making sure that you understand where your supply comes from. And that really is the essence of this concept of sustainability too, because everything is connected. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Report came out in 2005, so it's almost a decade old now, but defines our constituents of well-being is coming from the land. Well, anyone involved in agriculture knows that. All good things that we depend on as a society come from the land. We have, by God, 1,570 ecological scientists around the world who confirm this empirically. Well, we know this. We also know that these ecosystem services upon which we depend are in decline. They're in decline, some of them dramatically, about 30% of them dramatically, because we're increasing provisioning, but we're decreasing regulating and supporting in some cultural systems. And there are a number of reasons for that. And part of it's because everything's changing. And the rate of change is increasing faster than I can comprehend. I have one kid at Purdue, and I'm paying out-of-state tuition, so those of you from Indiana, you're welcome. Having my first kid in college has made me a better instructor because I really get pissed off when faculty members miss class now. And I'm paying for that. So just some lessons learned. I have two 13-year-old kids. My 13-year-old kids understand computer technology and general technology better than their 18-year-old sister. My 18-year-old daughter is too old to keep up. I'm 51 years old. I'm lost. You are too. Sorry, I don't presume that you're my age. Some of you are a little longer in the tooth than me. The rate of change is happening so fast we can't keep up. Now imagine if you're a multinational company who depends on supply chains spread all around the world, and you're trying to manage your reputational risk. You don't know where your stuff's coming from. You don't know who's producing it. You don't know if there's melamine in there to enhance the protein assay. You don't know what's in your stuff because you don't know where it's coming from or how it's coming from. We have this local retailer up the road from us in northwest Arkansas called Walmart, and I work very closely with them. And it's the world headquarters. And their biggest concern about sustainability isn't about being able to put a commercial on Sunday morning television saying Walmart's sustainable. They don't care about that. What they don't want on Sunday morning news shows is talking about people who died eating their product. Because as Lee Scott, 2 CEOs ago, said, it's bad for business to kill your customers with your products. Those of you in animal agriculture know that very well. So But security is an issue of trust. And we work with the Center for Food Integrity, Charlie Arnott's group out of Chicago. Incredible group. Some of you support them with your project or your corporate funds. What he says is that consumer attitudes are really what drive much of this trust issue, and the social license, freedom to operate, which the pork producers and poultry producers and dairy producers and all animal ag, beef producers all understand the license to operate is nothing you can take for granted anymore. With U.S. Humane Society lawsuits challenging your very premises of operation, you cannot just assume that society is going to allow you to behave the way you need to in order to be profitable and safe and productive. And then there's this criteria for legitimacy. What makes your practice, what makes your production process legitimate? Market competitiveness, of course, is everything, because if you can't make money, it's not sustainable inherently. And finally, reputational risk. And this is what drives Walmart. This is what drives Tesco. This is what drives Costco. This is what drives the retailers. Because they're not looking at consumer-facing competitiveness. They're looking at protecting their hind ends. They don't want another sweatshop burned down with 375 people killed because they're making cheap T-shirts, and that goes directly back to them. Reputational risk is everything. If you look at the agricultural supply chain from those of you who produce all the way to the consumer, there are a number of pathways to get here. These are the folks who are driving sustainability in my world, the retailers, because of this reputational risk issue. But when we talk about security of the supply chain and the role of GMOs, and I'll get to that, trust review. Safety, security, and stability are everything. Now, stability is what I'm going to focus on when we talk about genetically modified organisms, because in the United States, that predominantly right now means corn and soybeans for the feed industry, cotton, of course, but for us, it's corn and soybeans. Stability means the ability to put product in the market. We had a huge drought 2 years ago. How many of you were impacted by that drought? I decided to plant 2 acres of high-quality blackberries, $5 a piece. I planted $7,000 worth of blackberries that April, because it's a beautiful spring just like this. That April, I lost $7,000. Well, that's a big deal for me. I'm a hobby farmer. $7,000 is a day's loss for some of you guys, or an hour's loss for some of you guys. For our poultry producers who are losing 10% of their birds a day because of the 115-degree heat, it was catastrophic. So the ability to actually put products on the shelf, that's what we're talking about. But U.S. corn production in that record drought, a drought of 50 years, was down, but it wasn't that bad. It wasn't catastrophic. It was down. That was it. We were able to buffer that. And it wasn't because of GMOs. It's because of a whole suite of risk management practices our farmers participate in and engage in. And GMO crops are just an element of that. But because of less disease pressure, because of increased organic matter in our soil and increased tilth in our soil and soil water retention capacity, I am surmising that played a significant role. I have no evidence to prove it yet. But surmising that played a significant role in our ability to be resilient in an environmental crisis. Now, let's talk about trade. I told you I'm a damned engineer. How many of you are economists? Dermot's one. There's a lot of economists in the room. I'm barging in where angels fear to tread here, because I'm an engineer talking about trade. But I've had a chance to learn at the feet of some very smart people about what trade processes, what drives trade processes, and I've witnessed it firsthand. What I can see is the demand for product, as Dermot just told us, is going to drive trade. People want the stuff and they'll buy it. International and national trade is tied to safe, secure, and economical supply. That's a U.S. issue. It's also a global issue. But here's the issue that I experience in Europe. Barriers to trade are almost always rooted in economical nationalism. They're not rooted, they're in protectionism of markets. The two nations that are driving anti-GM movements in Europe are Germany and France. Their agricultural production systems are in the tanks. They are trying to recover a system that they have culturally and socially driven out of business. And they're trying to recover it by keeping other people's business out. And right now, this is the GM hook is a way to do that. It's a way to keep our products out. So they can buy non-GM corn and soybeans from Brazil for feed, and they can feed them to their animals, and they can say, we are not engaged in this risky process of feeding our people genetically modified crops. And yet they're bulldozing rainforests to do it. They're converting land to do it. And the evidence is clear. The data are clear. It's unsustainable. It's inherently bad for the ecosystem. That news is getting to Europe. We had the head of the largest retailer in Germany sit across the table from us and lecture us about the evils of genetically modified crops. And I asked about that issue. And his response is, we'll grow field beans to feed our animals. We don't need your damn soybeans. How many of you have grown field beans? Yeah. What do you think German field beans are going to do to feed crops? Their land mass isn't expanding. Now, I know that Germany has a history of reaching out for more lands, so there could be a potential expansion of their agricultural. I think they were looking at Poland pretty aggressively again. So there's some barriers. Some of these barriers are ideological, and you can't argue with the. What do they say about wrestling with a pig? It doesn't make any sense to have a scientific argument about ideology. You don't talk about religion or politics or sex. Those are all three ideological issues. In mixed company, you don't talk about them because you can't come to agreements with facts. Stability strategies, or sustainability strategies based on performance data can open markets, though, because I can tell you that the British, the Scandinavians, the Italians, and the Spanish desperately want our crops to feed their animals. Desperately want our crops to feed their animals. And they need the data to prove it. So here's where the hook comes in. Now, what's driving demand? Dermot implied some of this. So first of all, I suggest to you that UN population projections say we're going to hit between 9 and 10 billion in 40 years. So you get another 3 billion people coming to dinner. What we do in the next 10 years will determine how big this line gets. They're going to be more prosperous than ever. I can tell you also that my experience is that when technology and cultures collide, technology always prevails. Always prevails. Some of my ancestors were Cherokees. I'm the chair of the Environmental Protection Commission for the Cherokee Nation. I still work with Cherokees, and I can tell you we are very good at adopting the best next casino one-armed bandit. We are very good at adopting technologies. And that's one of the reasons our culture prevails or still exists today, is because we adopted Iron Age technologies when our Stone Age ancestors were confronted with it. That's an issue that's going to happen with GMO too. I would predict to you that within 10 years, European bans on maybe even 5, it happens usually real fast, these changes, the European resistance to GM will just evaporate. It'll just be gone. 1 year it won't be there anymore. Here's the thing about population. We reduced our population, our fertility, the number of children a woman has in her lifespan, based upon prosperity. And I'll talk to you more about that tomorrow if you want to hear about that tomorrow afternoon. This is one of the things that Norm taught me. But here's the other problem we have, or opportunity, as Dermot said. Those other 2.5 to 3 billion people come to dinner aren't going to be from around here. The more developed global north, our populations are virtually flatlining. The only reason the U.S. population is increasing is because of immigration. Thank God, because without that we have no labor force. Now those economists in the room can explain to me how we're going to actually have an economy when we have declining populations, which according to our current projections of human prosperity will happen in about 75 years. We'll actually hit population zero and start going back, not through some horrible process of restricting birth rates or some catastrophic disease. It will be because women are empowered and can choose, because of prosperity, can choose how many children they have and can focus more effort on those children they do have, and more of them will survive. That's the history of our country. It's the history of development of humanity, and it's happening everywhere on the planet. That's the reason population rates are declining now, and they will hit population zero in about 70 years. Another day I'd like to ask the question about how you have an economy when you have decreasing population, or an expanding economy. Right now, what you have is an expanding economy because you have expanding customers. And expanding demand for pork and poultry in particular are projected to just go through the roof. I was in Africa a year ago, the Congress for Feed and Food, and South Africa, and the big opportunities and discussions, excitement there were enhanced poultry production in Central and South Africa because of the dietary, because of disease pressure, dietary interests. But the problem that they have is they didn't have the advanced supply chain. They didn't have supply of feed. They didn't have adequate supply of feed. Now, as you'll see in a minute, South Africa is growing a lot of GM corn now. So those systems are all connected. I'm going to give you just just a little bit of, for animal agriculture, a little bit of choir practice, because sometimes the choir needs to tune up a little bit. Why animal agriculture is good. Because I can tell you there's a lot of folks I work with who tell me that animal agriculture is inherently unsustainable, it's immoral, and we shouldn't do it. And the data just say otherwise. I'm a scientist. I have my own ideology, but generally I'm not smart enough to have opinions. I just try to look at the data. Animal agriculture accounts for 40% of gross domestic product. Currently employs 1.3 billion people. That's all good. Here's the big deal. You talked about the impact of food and starvation with food prices. Of the roughly 800 to 900 million brothers and sisters who are chronically malnourished on the planet, and those are the folks that make less than $1 a day, the bottom billion. Of those 70% are partially or completely dependent on livestock for their livelihoods and food security. Livestock is a value amplifier for the poor. It was for my ancestors. It was for my grandparents in Oklahoma. Global meat production is expected more than double in 400 to 465 million tons by 2050. Milk production as well. Now, the argument goes, and just briefly touch on this, as the numbers of farms and animals reared for meat, eggs, and dairy production increases, so do emissions from their products. By 2050, global farm animal production is expected to double. We just saw that projection. The environmental impacts, this is from Konaswaran et al. 2008, the environmental impacts of animal agriculture require governments, international organizations, producers, and consumers to focus more attention on the role played by meat, egg, and dairy production. Mitigating and preventing environmental harms caused by this sector requires immediate and substantial changes in regulation, production practices, and consumption practices. That's the prescription coming from some sectors of the scientific community for the challenges. And what I would argue is this is exactly what we don't need. Livestock's long shadow, the first iteration, which was incorrect and was corrected, Pierre Gerber, who was a senior author, had no intentions of being incorrect. He was just informed by a lot of folks who were ideologically driven and didn't know any better. And came out with another version of it a few years later that corrected most of those errors. But it laid out that grazing and pasture lands account for 70% of land use in agriculture, 30% of land on Earth. That's, again, a fairly well-established fact. Livestock accounts for 8% of total human water use, largely from irrigation of crops up the food chain. Livestock degradation, in order to respond to those, they recommend restoring damaged lands through soil conservation, greenhouse emissions, through sustainable intensification of livestock and feed crops. Now, this comes back to this trade issue because one of the prescriptions from the FAO, and even with an ideological bent against animal agriculture, they're suggesting that we need intensification. Intensification is a mechanism to achieve reduced impacts for a given outcome. Better management of animal waste and industrial production for water, biodiversity loss is about intensification too. Now, these slides will be available to all of you guys, so you're welcome to use them however you see fit. Now, the reverse tackling the climate change through livestock, which is the revised version of Livestock's Long Shadow, provides a better, I think, more accurate vision of where globally our impact from animal agriculture is in the landscape and the role that crops play. I'm coming back to crops and trade here in a moment. Potential greenhouse gas emissions are a big focus for them, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, just released yesterday, unembargoed yesterday, a major report, which is frightening in its projections. They're suggesting that we could have as much as an 8-degree total temperature shift on our planet in the next 100 years. 8 degrees. 2 degrees was catastrophic. When I first started working with climate change issues in 1996, 2 degrees was going to be catastrophic. Well, we probably already hit that. Now we're looking at a potential 8-degree shift. We don't know what that means. The uncertainties, error bars just go nuts when you get that big. So greenhouse gases are going to be an issue that we have to think about, and of course, that's in animal agriculture. It's almost all methanogenesis, right? It's the production of methane and release of methane from the animal in the gut, and then it's also in the manure because you're feeding them a product that was atmospheric CO2 less than a year ago. So it's a cycle. Sustainable ag intensification and is about intensification, and it's also about increasing profitability of the enterprise, and that's the Chinese challenge: is how do you increase the profitability? Jim, you're going to have to help me with time because I forgot my watch because I flew today.
You're doing fine.
So what we do is we'll talk about. I won't bore you with the process of life cycle assessment because it is fundamentally accounting. And when I early on was working with Dr. Borlaug as an undergraduate, he said, agronomists really aren't going to save the world. Policymakers and economists are. And I said, crap, I'm not going to be either of those. But economics really do drive this in accounting. But what we evaluated dairy industries from production, from grass to glass, to evaluate sort of production, process, and distribution consumption just to see where these things are, to see where the greenhouse gases are coming from. This is the work we did with Dairy Research Institute, and we found that the feed, enteric methane, and manure management really produce most of the greenhouse gases in the system. Transportation, processing, distribution because of fuel use, do retail and consumption, and disposal, not so much. But in dairy, really all the action's in production of the feed, and also it's in the gut and the poo of the cow. So the animal is where the action is, and the feed that you give the animal. We did the same thing with pork, and we found across the whole, from sow barn finishing, processing, packaging, retail, consumption, we really found that it's in the manure and the feed. That's where greenhouse gas emissions come from. Now, if you want to try to move the needle and reduce greenhouse gases, find out where they come from. And that's what we're doing here. What this tells us is a very simple thing, that if you want to reduce greenhouse gases and make those crops more efficient, and this is a process for overcoming the trade resistance for GMOs in Europe, what you need to focus on is feed efficiency, feed metabolism efficiency, crop production efficiency, reducing the amount of water, or the greenhouse gases in this case, as it takes to produce the crop. So it's all about improving feed and reducing manure. Nutrient digestibility, gut function, immune system. You veterinarians in the room, you all know this. This is what animal agriculture can do and is doing. Let's talk about the crop itself, though. If we look at, I work with Field to Market. I'm on the executive committee for Field to Market, the Alliance for Sustainable Agriculture. It's an entire agricultural supply chain from U.S. soybeans all the way to Walmart and McDonald's retailers with World Wildlife Fund, Nature Conservancy, and Conservation International Environmental Defense Fund, and other NGOs at the table, trying to identify key performance indicators for sustainability for agriculture, and then evaluate those using our best scientific data. This is looking at entire U.S. sector soybeans across each of these metrics, and we benchmarked each of these to 2,000 because it was a good round number. And so 2,000 would be 1.0 on this radar diagram. And so as this, we call it the field print, gets smaller, that means you're getting better. What we're seeing is that on 5-year averages from 84 to 2010, we have dramatically reduced the field print of U.S. soybeans and corn, dramatically. Look at the soil erosion. I'm a grandson of the Dust Bowl. I know what soil erosion does. It destroys communities, it destroys ecosystems, it destroys economies. This is a success story that's unheralded in this country. We don't know, our consumers don't know, that we have some of the most sustainable, from these metrics perspective, sustainable crops in the nation. You look at wheat. Wheat has not moved very much in the last 20 years. It's not a GM crop yet. So, what are the processes that allow this to happen? Genetically modified crops allow us to use less pesticide, and I'm not an advocate for it. I'm an outcomes guy. I don't care what the technology is. I don't have any shares in any of these companies either, or I don't get paid, nor do I get paid by them, or do research for them. What I can tell you is, though, the outcomes are clear. We have higher organic matter. We have some producers of soybeans who haven't plowed their fields, deep furrow plowed their fields in 10 years, because they don't have to. Because they can drill the seeds in, and because they can top apply, and they can control weeds and pests without tillage. Same with corn. So across the board, we're getting better. Now, I did work with a group of colleagues on a manuscript, Climate Adaptation Imperatives, Global Sustainability Trends, and Eco-Efficiency. So we looked at eco-efficiency across canola, cotton, maize, and soybeans around the world over the last 10 years, 2000 to 2010, to see which ones are changing. And what we're seeing is that that we're seeing some of our best improvements relatively in corn, maize, and in soybeans, and in canola. Cotton's flatlining a little bit, but we're seeing some statistically significant improvements. Here's what we are arguing. Here's the sort of heuristic behind this process. Eco-efficiency, the ability to get something off the landscape without damaging it, or damaging it less for what you get out of it, regardless of your metrics, and yield both go up as you move from subsistence to technology adoption through mechanization, which is the trajectory of development of agriculture in this country and in Europe and the rest of the world. It's what's happening in Brazil. It flatlines a little bit because it asymptotes towards the maximum. Everything does, right? At high intensifications. But our best wins are going to come through these sort of, what China's going through now, this mechanization. So that's really good news for the planet, because that means we should be able to produce, conceptually, we should be able to increase production to meet that increasing demand without damaging those ecosystems. couple more facts. Corn production in the U.S. is through the roof. 30% of global yield on 20% of planted corn area in this country. The most efficient corn producers in the world. 7% of production was exported to 100 different countries. Japan, Mexico, China were most of those. And you saw these graphs for production and export. So I don't want to... You'll have those in the presentation if you need them. Soybeans. Soybeans are a little different story. It's 1.7 bushels of soy, so we're producing the value of exports set new records, 28 million last year, 19% increase from 2012. 1.3 bushels of whole soybeans, meal, and oil. China is our biggest buyer here, though they're not, as you point out, they're not buying that much. Their biggest buyer, that's why we're looking at Europe as another buyer, Mexico and Japan. So soybeans again. Each year, the EU member states import 40 million tons of soy material, predominantly destined for animal feed. They've got hungry animals. Let's talk about the EU now, because GMAs in the EU, the first lines of GMAs were approved in 97. Spain became the first country to put it to use. About 80,000 hectares of Spain's maize is in production, genetically modified. It's now taking place in the Czech Republic, Portugal, and Germany, though Germany just issued a ban on it. So field area for BT maize decreased in 2009 because of in France and Germany, national cultivation bans for BT were enacted in 2009 against the EU rules. So that would be like Alabama saying we're going to ban GM crops. And meanwhile, stricter coexistence regulations apply in almost EU member states. This coexistence stuff is another word for litigation and for damages for adventitious trades. So I work with the World Wildlife Fund a lot. Jason Clay is the Senior Vice President for World Wildlife Fund. That's not a normal animal or crop ag collaborator. What Jason says is that these are the persistent issues in sustainability: locally grown, GMO, organic, and natural. And the World Wildlife Fund doesn't care about those one whit, because those aren't outcomes that matter to them. They're trying to preserve biodiversity on the planet. Water use efficiency, soil use, soil organic carbon, land use change, and biodiversity loss are what matter to them. This is a very, very strong coalition potential for U.S. agriculture, working with conservation organizations. It has high potential for us to align our interests for intensification of agriculture. Jason says that the predominant way we're going to feed the planet is by freezing the footprint of agriculture. Freezing the footprint of agriculture means intensification, and the role of research is the key to that. Most of the processes you're going to need are going to come from genetics, improved management practice, technology. Now, I'll finish up here with GMO Compass was actually funded by the EU. Again, you have a website. They produced a briefing paper a year ago last summer called EU Scientists Call for GMO Policies and Practices for Sustainable Agriculture. This is from public sector scientists active in biotechnology researchers and farmers' organizations. And they subscribe to the freedom of farmers to use crops they find best suited for their needs, including GM crops that have been approved through the European regulatory system. Freedom to operate. I've got a lot of quotes from the document here. In essence, much public sector biotech research for sustainable agriculture in Europe has been slowed, stopped, or moved elsewhere because of regulatory hurdles. Their agricultural industry is dying to death, and they know it. Those folks involved in it. They painted themselves into an ideological corner. Sustainability metrics are one way they can get out of that, because they can show that in the deal with the devil, GMO is better than non-GMO. So, as we work with sustainability, and to tie this into putting food on the table and trade, opening markets, we're advocating for key performance indicators that are outcomes-based, science-driven, technology-neutral, and transparent.